Well, good evening, listeners. It's evening for me for the Lament of Hope podcast, and it is morning of the next day for Bruce Spence, who I'm speaking with today, which always baffles my mind whenever I interview anyone from across the world that they've already lived my today and have slept and are already in the next day. And that that seems a little frightening to me, but it's amazing how that happens. Um, but anyway, Bruce Spence, he's a very renowned Australian actor, but he's been in several films. He actually last year received the Equity Foundation Lifetime Achievement Award for his. He's had over 100 films and TV appearances that he's done in his career as an actor. He's been in several Australian theater companies. He was in Lord of the Rings as the Mouth of Sauron. He was in Stork, the 1971 film version of that. He was in Matrix, Star Wars. And then one other thing that I found very interesting when I was looking more into his life is that he's had a heart for benevolence toward other actors, and especially during the COVID pandemic, he was involved in helping a lot of actors through that time, as that was a dry period for not only people who aren't acting, but especially for actors, because movies were frozen in time and nobody was doing anything. So he was helping out during that time, and has just been known to have a big heart for actors in general. So Bruce, I want to thank you so much for coming on the podcast and taking the time to be here.
Thank you very much. It's fine to be here. I'm ready to go.
Well, Bruce, I wanted to say, how does it feel when someone says you've been over, oh, it's over 100 titles, television and film that you've been in? How does that make you feel? Do you feel
Uh,
like, wow, I'm accomplished great things, or does that just make you feel older?
um, Look, it's sort of like a moment in time, really, for me. The past is the past. I must admit, when I do look back on all those films and all that work, it is a long time, and that's I do feel old. But as an actor, you're really preoccupied with the now. You're preoccupied with your next project, etc. Well, I must admit, I'm the sort of person that once I finish a project and it's up there on the screen or up there on the stage, etc., and maybe the season is over, um, I move on, and that I don't dwell on those films much. Um,
Okay.
the thing that preoccupies me is the next activity, or because that's where the creativity occurs, is when you are actually practicing your craft. So when you're on stage or when you're in front of a camera, that's the thing that's exciting for me. And working with other actors or working with crew, etc. That's the exciting thing, creating it.
Do you have a preference? Do you prefer stage to film or?
Um, no, I don't have a preference really. I do like to mix them. I love stage, and I always have, and hopefully I still will be working on stage, even though I'm turn 80 this year. Um, uh, Working on stage is a real test for an actor, working in front of an audience, especially as you get older, because learning lines gets a little harder. But um, uh, that's really testing. Um, there's something about working in front of a camera. If you don't get it right the first time, you can try it again. And but all the same, it's a very serious occupation working in front of a camera. You want to get it right the first time. Um, but and on stage, you're wanting to get, every night you're wanting to make that performance the best that you can do.
Yeah.
Um, but I love the variation in them.
Do you have a favorite story that you've done that I know you've done so many different stories, but I wonder if maybe there was one in particular that really struck
Yeah.
you?
That's interesting because I often get asked that question about, what's the most enjoyable film that you've been in or play or whatever. And I really don't have a favorite because they've all been fantastic. They've all been testing. Well, not all of them, but most of them have been fantastic. Um, but they test you in different ways. That's the great thing about working in film and television. That's the great thing about being an actor, that you don't know what sort of a role is around, you're going to be around the corner. Um, whether or not you're going to be in a horror movie or a comedy or whatever. That's what's so exciting about role playing. Um, so and I guess each role sort of is another exploration of your own personal psyche
Yeah.
of that aspect of you. Um, so I've enjoyed many roles, and I've enjoyed many plays too. Um, uh, as long as they test me, I must admit, if I feel I'm getting lazy in a role or it's just a bit too easy, then there's something wrong with what I'm doing.
Well, I'm sure all the directors listening and everyone you've ever worked with is so happy that all of the movies, you've not made anyone mad. You've done that was such a diplomatic statement.
Yeah. Well,
I,
I must admit there are times when when you're working on especially those big films, when you're working on a film and with some directors they might go up to 10 takes or more, but mind you, it might not be your performance. It might be other things happening in the scene. But the, but often there's a mystery working with a director. Sometimes the director will say, "Look, I want to go again. I'm not sure what it is, but I just like there's something." I don't know what it is. I can't articulate it, but can we just go again and let's see what we can do? And and often they'll end up with keeping the first take or the second take or whatever. And there are some directors where they'll shoot one or two takes and they'll say, yeah, that's fine. So with some directors they're very demanding or they're very unsure of what they're doing, and some directors they're very confident or they're the kind of director that likes to shoot fast. And once you know that that director wants to shoot fast, right, he wants to go with this one or two takes. You know that you have to be prepared right from that very first take. And there are
yeah.
some directors you know that they're going to go for 10, 15 takes. So you know that you can build up or you can explore or you can try different things, etc.
Well, as you mentioned horror before, I wanted to ask you because I was talking to someone the other day and they told me, there's certain roles they won't do. And one in particular was that was mentioned was like a serial killer. And they said, unless they really had a compelling reason to do it, they didn't want to explore that because it's just such a dark side of humanity that exists. And they don't want to have to go there and immerse themselves in that. And then whatever, repercussions come from that, um, they just don't want to do it. So they kind of stay away from that. I wanted to ask you, when you mentioned horror, is that a hard genre for you? Like, is it, because I know some actors, they dive in and they can easily snap out of it. They don't, it doesn't affect them to their personal life. But a lot of actors I've talked to, especially on the stage, said because each night has to be different, and if they're playing a character that is evil or particularly complex, each night they're doing it differently because they can't, it does not completely replicate it the same. And so each night they're exploring it deeper and deeper or in a newer way. And it's hard for them. And it gets to a point sometimes where they just feel very like it actually affects their mental health or their well-being because they just feel depressed. And I wanted to ask you, is that something you've ever faced, or do you find it easier to separate, okay, I'm Bruce, this character isn't me, and so when I'm done playing them, then I can just go back to myself?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And there are some roles I wouldn't do, especially some horror roles that are just very indulgent or morally wrong, morally questionable. Um, and there are a number of roles in that as within that aspect that I wouldn't do. Here's an example of amusing one. immersing myself in a character that I felt that was very testing. Many years ago, in the late 1970s, I played the lead in a play, an Australian play called The Floating World, and the play was essentially about madness, and it was the central character. The character that I played was a he had come back from the Second World War, and I don't know if you're familiar with it, but in the a lot of Australian soldiers, and I think some American soldiers, but a lot of Australian soldiers were ended up as prisoners under the Japanese and
Mm.
were in forced labor on the Burma Railway. And on the Burma Railway, many men died of starvation. They died of beating, the beatings that the Japanese soldiers gave them, etc.
Mm.
And a lot of soldiers died, and that's a very vivid part of our history, the memory of all the Burma Railway, and the
And
character that
you,
I.
just to say, you also lost a good deal of men in the First World War, right? With
Oh
Gallipoli?
yeah, absolutely. We lost. People talk about the Battle of Gallipoli
Yeah.
that was in Turkey, but we lost a lot more in the Battle of the Somme, and we lost tens of thousands of men in the First World War. For a small country, that was terrible. But anyway, the character that I played was had been a prisoner in on the Burma Railway,
Mm.
and every night he virtually it's set on board a ship, and that's his son-in-law has shouted him a cruise to Japan. Um, and as he gets closer to Japan, the memories of his past come back, and he feels very he's guilt-ridden because the memories through the play, some of these characters from his past who died on the Burma Railway come back to him and sort of accuse him of being betraying them, etc. But the last 20 minutes of the play is, excuse me, is Les in a straitjacket. He's sort of had a nervous breakdown, exorcising himself of the past and reliving all these horrific events.
Oh,
Um, and he sort of, uh, it was very physical because I sort of, it was a very physical performance. And even though I was in a straitjacket, I managed to sort of throw myself around the stage a lot and almost almost into the audience. But I relive all these things, and performing that play really did tax me, and I really had to sort myself out virtually during the day to make sure I could separate that reliving those events and that going through that character's journey in that play, which
huh.
was a pretty taxing moment. And then just jumping from that to Lord of the Rings, where played the Mouth of Sauron, which is a pretty sort of dark character. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but in
Yeah.
that one, he's a very dark character, and fortunately, he ends up having being beheaded by Aragon. But
You're like, that's good.
yeah, thanks, guys. But I mean, that was sort of Lord of the Rings is almost a fantasy, so it depends on the kind of horror that you're talking about. I mean,
Yeah.
there's some jokey stuff that you know. Uh, I'd almost consider things like Ghostbusters has an element of horror in that film, although it's a comedy. So
Right. Yeah.
it depends on just sort of how one treats these things. But I must admit, yeah, I do think one should have a respect for the human condition in some way, and I do have very strong I do have moral and political reasons for why I shouldn't do something that is degrading to to the human condition, etc. But
Well, I was gonna say that when you were talking about what you did with the story about the man suffering from PTSD, because that, I mean, it sounds like very
Yeah.
just extreme. First of all, I don't get why his relative would send him to Japan. I feel like that's the dumbest thing you could possibly do. I would give him a cruise somewhere else. I don't know why he didn't think about that. But anyway, sending him back to where he'd been. Anyhow, what was hard was with that though, you are telling something that so many people go through and something that would relate to your country so keenly that it's important, I think, to share a story like that. I think what's hard for me, and I want your thoughts on this, is, you know, once in a while, actually kind of recently, I watched my first horror film that was really horror. And I didn't know it was, and then it started, and then halfway through, I was like, okay, I think this is a horror movie. And then by the time it ended, I was like, yeah, that's what it is. And I hated it. Like, I just felt like felt so dirty. I hadn't learned anything. I hadn't gained anything about the human experience. I just was scared, terrified. That was the only feeling I had was I'm terrified. And when I ended it, I just thought, what's the purpose of that? Good storytelling, I feel like, is supposed to convey something to your audience that they can take with them into life. But something that just makes you afraid, and life is already full of fear. Why do we need to just make a movie to make you scared? And I think for me, that's the hard part is when it's like, it's the fear factor that is the main thing. That's the plot, that's the character that they want you to focus on. And I just don't see anything redemptive in that. But I don't know how you feel about that.
Well, well, I tend to agree. I mean, I'm not a look. Being an actor, I can sort of play in those roles like Matrix, etc. But I must admit, as an audience member, I I can't take horror. I don't go to. I don't go. I'm not. Don't indulge myself in the horror movies. I don't indulge myself in a lot of those violent movies either. I'm not impressed by them. But and I make that choice. But see, it's a hard thing. Um, it's a real dilemma about things like censorship, etc. That I am sort of conflicted in a way that I feel that we shouldn't. There's a lot of movies that we shouldn't have that should be illegal. Snuff movies and various. There is a point at which we've got to draw a line. But at the same time, I think there should be a degree of freedom in telling stories. There should be a
Yeah,
degree of we shouldn't be inhibited in telling
that's
um,
true.
the truth about ourselves, because as human beings, we make incredible journeys. We make all sorts of journeys. Some of them end up, they're humorous or they're light, etc. Some of them are very dark, and we go through, terrible things. Um,
Mm.
I don't want to go into the details of it, but my childhood, my father was an alcoholic and very violent, and especially towards my mother, and that's the reason why I grew up in New Zealand and I came here to sort of escape all that stuff. Um, but I know I experienced sort of um, periods of absolute despair and very unpleasant moments, and moments when as I was getting older, I intervened in between my father and my mother, and which in a way exacerbated things to a degree between myself and my father, anyway. But I'm
And
saying,
I just
what,
want to ask, when you meant
what,
older, you don't
I,
mean like an old man.
oh,
You meant an
my,
older child.
what are you talking about, me or my father?
Oh no, you, just so the audience, when you say you get in between two people, you're talking about as a child you would
I,
get in
I
between.
entered, when I was a young teenager, I
Okay.
intervened between my father and my mother because he was beating her.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Um, and to stop him. And in fact, that was the beginning. In a way, that was the beginning of the end fortunately for my mother, because she left him very soon after that. But mind you, this is a time, I'm talking about the 1960s, and this is a time, especially in Australia, where if a woman was to leave her husband, she really had very few legal grounds for any compensation against the person. You
Sure.
sort of left with nothing. But these days, it's much better. These days, there are all sorts of protections and laws about domestic violence, and even though domestic violence still exists. But all I'm saying is that I've been through very, very dark periods personally, and I have no wish to go through them in a cinema. Um,
Hmm.
although there are some journeys that I do like to take. I don't know if you remember the film Normandy, which was, sorry, Dunkirk. Um,
Yes.
and there are many war films that I've seen that I just think are just brilliantly done about the human condition. Because one of the things that there's a um when a human being is in crisis, um, they can reveal all sorts of things about themselves. And that's where drama really comes in. And great stories are told about human beings in crisis. And in a way, many stories, that's really what it is. It's the
Yeah.
trigger of a crisis in some way, and a dilemma solving problem. So in a way, we do have to deal with that. We do have to deal with our inner demons as well. We do have to have stories that have a moral ending to them too, as well, that we can learn from. Um, so, I mean, there are many reasons to tell stories, but that's one of the great things about storytelling.
Yeah.
Um, and in fact, I know I'm raging far and wide here, but the myths sort of have always interested me, the mythology, because right from the very early Greeks and the very early Romans, etc., and even before that, I guess when we were cave people, when you know, um, we were sort of nomadic groups of people wandering this earth. Um, we had stories. We always told stories.
Yeah.
There were always questions being asked by people that needed answers. And
Yeah.
sometimes people gave us answers, and that's where I guess myths came in, and in a way almost religion came into a way. But mythology, all of those wonderful mythological stories that I don't know if you're familiar with Joseph Campbell, but and Joseph Campbell was able to collate all those stories, and every culture on this earth has a need to tell stories, and there are great similarities between those stories. That the hero has to make these journeys and through various lands, etc., or through various. He has to make his own life journey through various crises,
Yeah.
and to somehow resolve them. And there are parallels that each culture, in a way, has almost the same story. I mean, I'm
Mm-hmm.
not saying there is a same story, but there are many stories. But you can tell that, oh, you have that story, or you have, yeah, there's an element of that too.
Yeah.
Um, that, so that's what I'm just getting back to drama. That there are dark, often, like, say we're going to go to the cinema this weekend, or, hypothetically with my wife, and we'll sit down and say, look, we're going to see a comedy, or we're going to see a drama, or we're going to see something really dark, and we'll make that choice.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. It is a choice thing. I definitely
Mm.
don't think I agree with you that, to an extent, probably, and there is, and I don't know much about it, but there is certain censorship on certain things, but in general, I do think it's up to the audience member to decide what they want to put in their brain or not. Um, but I do want to ask you, it must have been very hard for you to play the sailor. I'm not the sailor, I'm sorry, the soldier, because PTSD, even if you do not relate to the war aspect, that still must be hard because I mean, I know I suffer from it, and mine is not related to war. Mine is also related to childhood, and it's very hard for me. I mean, I would say it's cathartic in some ways, but it's also very hard to see something that triggers any sort of mental disturbance in somebody because that always brings me back to whatever I experienced. And so that must have been a very hard role, I would think, that you would have to writhe around in a straitjacket and go through those own memories because I would feel like you'd have to kind of dig into maybe even your own to come across as authentic with that. That must have been hard.
Uh, yeah, yes, it was hard, but well, it's. I got to say this: the playwright who unfortunately has dementia at present, and he's not long for this world, but um, I've known throughout my career, and he's written a number of plays for me, and I did a one-man play for him. He is a great writer. The language of the play is wonderful.
Hmm.
And there's nothing better than, if you're doing Shakespeare or whatever, if it's a dark piece. But so I was able to sort of immerse myself in the character that way. But look, it's interesting what you say about the difficulty of doing it. It was sort of difficult, but you once you're inside it, if you understand that character, if you really, we did a lot of research, and I spoke to folk who were alive at that time who had been in those such situations, and I got sort of close to that area, and I don't know how many books about that period of time, about that period in our Australian history that I read at the time, and at the same time of understanding that journey, my private personal journey. I must admit, I had real problems when I first came to Australia adjusting, and I ended up by going to, having psychiatric help. Well, I mean, going to see someone and talking to them about it. And one day, and there were, I don't know if you've been through situations like that, and I thought, oh God, having these chats with this guy, and unfortunately, because of our health system here, it wasn't costing me anything. Um, and I thought these talks, we're not getting anywhere. The
Yeah.
chat, waste.
I've been
This
there.
is a one gigantic waste of time. And then one day, but then little gems would drop, and I thought, yeah, that's. And one day, because my father, the more I understood about my father and why and how these things occurred, nobody does these things out of nothing. And I realized that my father had been brought up in a Catholic orphanage. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with what occurred in Catholic orphanages during this would have been during the 1930s and 1940s. But
Yeah, it
over
was
here,
not, you're not great.
it was very unpleasant. And there
Yeah.
were all sorts of horror stories that came from the children that survived those orphanages. And so I often thought he's probably been brutalized in those in that Catholic orphanage, and that's possibly partly made him what he is. And when I left this on this particular day when I left my psychiatrist, and he said, I was just getting to the door, and he said, "Oh, by the way," he said, "just one little point. Your father loved you." He said, "I know what we know what he did to you, etc. But because of his past, it's quite likely that he couldn't deal with love. He couldn't he that love was something that he kind of would embrace and then think, what the hell am I doing? And then reject it
Yeah.
in a violent way.
Hmm.
And so he was going through this enormous battle inside his own head. And I subsequently he did have problems later on, but eventually he did. But and I, I think what we need to do in those sort of situations is there really is no black and white in this world. But one thing we must never lose as human beings is empathy. We must be, we must blaming people all the time. It's your fault that I'm like this. Bothers me really much. And I've been familiar with this with friends that have had kids that have turned against them or whatever, or I've dealt with people of my own age who have said, "Oh, my father or my mother was, terrible to me, and she did. And when I said, well, what did she do? You think, hang on, what that parent did, it wasn't all that enormous. I mean, what I mean is, you need to understand why that person did what they did, even though it affected you personally in a very
I see.
unconstructive way.
Well, I think what you're trying to say is you say when we're really angry at someone and they've hurt us, right? It is the hurt becomes all they are. So when you look at them, you just see the hurt and the
That's
pain, and
exactly.
they're like a criminalized object. And you're saying when you say it's not so enormous, you're not saying, "Oh, your pain doesn't count." It's that yes, your pain counts, but you're also looking at someone else who is in pain, and therefore it takes a little bit of that all that
Exactly.
light around them. You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
We need a little bit of understanding.
Yeah.
Yeah. I
Well,
mean,
did you
life, sorry, go on.
I was gonna say, do you forgive your dad?
Oh yeah, I did that. I did that ages ago.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. I even spoke at his funeral. Whereas some of my brothers and sisters refused to. Um, look, that's been my, how can I put it? Look, right from my early days when I first started acting, which was in a motley group because I was at arts. I actually gone to art school, and um, I was a student at art school, and I got involved with this group that had this. We're going to create, at that stage. There was very little Australian drama. It was all, English plays or the old American play, etc. Um, and very little written by ourselves. And we formed this group that said, "Look, we're going to make Australian drama. And that's why, as I said, I did that play with the about the prisoner of war, the ex-prisoner of war. Well, that was written by John Romerell, who won a number of awards here and was one of our top playwrights at that period of time. And we had about 3 or 4 playwrights within the group, and we were developing our own plays. And it was a sort of a unique group. We weren't aware of the fact that we were making history. People look back on this group and say, "Wow, you're part of the what was known as the Australian Performing Group." Um, but at the time, we were just playing around. We were just a group of enthusiastic people wanting to, do this thing. But I don't know where I'm getting at with the question you asked, but it was a big journey. Oh, I know what I'm getting at. We were also a very political group. Um, we at the time what we were in the very early days of our group, the Vietnam War was at its height, and I don't know if you're aware of it, but we had a lot of Australians who were fighting in the Vietnam War too, because we thought it was all the way with LBJ with us. Because we felt if the Americans are there, then we had a duty to be there, and a lot of Australians died there too. And that was the height of, we were demonstrating against the Vietnam War
Mm.
very, very strongly. And we were actually writing plays about that too. But also when there was a demonstration, we'd form this guerrilla theatre group where we'd perform these little vignettes in the demo, and that only would last about 30 seconds, etc. So we were always politically engaged at that time. And I must admit, I've been a political animal pretty well all my life. Um, and, my politics have always been sort of to the left, progressive politics. Um, and I haven't stopped. Mm,
Now the left, when you say left, Australia left or
yeah,
America
Australia.
left?
No, no. Well, I don't know what the American left is, but it's Australian left. It's it's a progressive. Oh, how can I put it? Um, my politics would be very similar to Bernie Sanders.
Okay.
It's sort of like that. That's where I think I would sit. Now
Okay.
I'm just guessing. He might be a bit too radical, or he might be not radical. But that's somewhere around there. But um, you know, my politics would be very similar to someone like Bruce Springsteen. I'm trying to find parallels in your culture.
Well, it
Um,
sounds like you just care deeply about many things. So when you say you're a political person, it is more
oh
than,
yeah,
yeah.
it's one of the reasons why I was chairperson of the Actors Benevolent Fund here and just helping those. I
Yeah.
volunteer, every Wednesday I volunteer to because I have a horticultural background as well, because my family were winemakers, and I studied horticulture at university in my very, very early days. But so I volunteer in the Botanic Gardens here, helping them propagate plants every Wednesday. And often there are, some very rare plants that we might propagate, but I assist them there for, that's just a volunteer, as a volunteer. Um, but I do a lot of sort of that sort of work where I help in the community if I can. Um, it's just part of a natural thing for me, I guess, working together with people. That's the I'm raving a bit now, but that's the wonderful thing about acting. The thing I like about acting, you asked the question, would I what's the best, the film that I've enjoyed most or whatever. The thing I enjoy about acting is working with other people. I
Yeah.
love working with the crew. I love working with other actors. Without the other actor, there is no drama. Even though I've done one person plays, I've been in them and worked on. It's hard work when you're on your own and you get awfully lonely. But I love working with a cast of people. That camaraderie that you have and that creativity working together is just wonderful. Um, it's not a competition being an actor. If you work well off another actor, you both benefit each other, and that's the wonderful thing about acting.
I think that is a very wise perspective. I'm not sure every actor feels that way. I think in America, I don't know how it is in Australia. Maybe it's different. You can tell me, but in America, uh, we very quickly idolize certain actors and actresses, and then we make up, we love to make up these stories about what's going on in their life and why they're wearing what they're wearing or why this is missing, blah, 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 blah. And we have, and this is my opinion, so people listening may disagree, and that's fine. Um, but the Oscars over time has just become kind of a joke. It's very much, the
Yeah,
people who get the awards didn't really do the best job. It just fits a certain period of time or season that Hollywood is in, and therefore that's what the person's gonna get. And it is very competition. It's who's the prettiest, who's the sexiest, who's the oldest woman who can stay as sexy as possible, and she's gonna get the most roles. But then you may turn around and see this other older actress who is way better at acting, but doesn't have the same sexy appeal, so she's not going to get those roles. And so
yeah.
in America, it feels like a competition all the time, whether or not the actor or actress will say it is. The industry is very competitive. And so I wonder, I don't know if Australia is different, but here it's a big competition, and that's a really sad part of it is the art of it. I think gets lost a lot of times in the competition.
Well, yeah. Acting is a very precarious business to be in if you want to have a career as an actor. It's not easy. Um, but and I and I can sort of, in a way, I can understand why those people do what they do at those Oscar. Look, let me just say at this stage, I'm not a friend of the Oscars in the sense that I don't. I tend to lean towards what you're saying, that for me, the idea of the best actor or the best supporting actor or the best film, I just don't understand that. I think there are so many good actors. Now, when there are nominations, and you've got what is it, six or four or so many people that have been nominated for an award. Each one of those people, each one of those people that have been nominated are excellent in their own right. And I don't understand how one can have a best actor, whether it's the Oscars or the BAFTAs or the Australian Film Awards or whatever. I just cannot understand how one can have a best actor or a best film. That's why when people ask me, what's the best film you've been in? I don't know, because I had, when I did the Mad Max 2 Road Warrior, I had a wonderful experience on that. I had a wonderful experience on doing, say, The Matrix. Fascinating experience working on Star Wars. And I could go through a whole list of films. They were all really enjoyable, and I loved working on them. I loved working with the actors for personal reasons or for professional reasons or whatever. It's like working on in a play. That's the most exciting thing, as I said, is working with other actors. If I'm working in a play, working with a cast of actors can be just wonderful, just so exciting. And you come home at night after a show and you think, "Wow, I just had a great night on stage with my other actors." And you can come back, you can go home also and say, "Wow, that was awful. It's terrible. Something was wrong." And fortunately, most times, on most occasions, the audience is not aware of it at all. And you might go out and say, "Oh, did you notice, there was a point where that was," no, didn't notice that at all, didn't see it, because they all think it's all fine. But anyway, as I said, the idea of acting being a competition just bewilders me. And as I said, that's ego is a fascinating thing, and as actors have a lot of it, and some unfortunately so. Um, you need a bit of ego. You need a bit of ego to explore that character and to bury yourself into it and to have confidence to expose yourself. Because
Yeah.
let's face it, when the camera rolls and you say, "Well, here I am. This is me. This is my personality naked. I've committed myself to this character, and I'm going to go for it." Now, be he, a comic role or a dark role or whatever, but you're immersed in the reality and the truth of that character, and you just declare it. And sometimes it can be, oh, the director might look at it and say, "No, no, that's not what I had in mind. That's not at all what I had in mind. Can we just steer that a bit a bit the other way?" You think, "Oh God." So you are disturbed by it. But look, fortunately, that hasn't happened to me. I've been very lucky, and I've managed to have struck the character pretty accurately. But but that chemistry of working with another actor or director is fantastic if they're as generous to you as you are to them. And I think that's what makes magical drama. And I often I see it in, like, well, I don't know if you've seen it, but I've forgotten the name of the title. Is it Only Murders in the Building?
Oh, you mean with
With
Selena? Is
Martin
it with the
Short.
one with Selena Gomez, Martin Short, and
Yeah,
Steve
yeah.
Martin? Yeah.
Now, watching those three actors work together, they've got a wonderful rapport. And in a way, that's and obviously they enjoy one another. They and you can that's what makes that that series work so well.
Yeah.
And a lot of all the guest actors obviously enjoy being in it. And that's the kind of thing where you can see there's a kind of generosity to one another. There's no kind of competition. And it's great to watch actors working in that sort of situation. But
Yeah.
nine times out of ten, you'll find that most actors are pretty generous. There are, forgive me for saying it, but there are some assholes in the business, but not generally that they're pretty good. I must admit I have not encountered any very few, very, very few problem actors I encountered.
Hmm. That is good to know. That's encouraging.
Oh yeah, yeah.
I wanted to ask you, you'd mentioned earlier, it really struck me when you mentioned that you have not only a keen sense of a political passion, but also a moral code or a moral outlook. I don't know if you're okay sharing this or not, but I was curious, are you religious at all, or is the moral outlook something that you've gleaned from living life and watching other and your own experience, or where when you mention moral code, because to be honest, a lot of people don't say that wording as much anymore. I was curious to see if that was when you mean moral code, what are you talking about exactly?
Um, no, I'm not religious. In fact, I have a very, oh, I'm not at all impressed by religion. It's responsible for so much agony in this world. I mean, I'm not going to mention any particular arenas, especially the Middle East. I mean, and also in some in Europe. Um, but I think religion can how can I put it? It's well, here's an example. Christianity, the number of different kinds of Christianity there are in the world, you know, there's lots of them. The different, there's Catholic, Protestant, Mormon, you name it. They're all there, and they all have their own interpretations of what's written in a book. Now, now, the book is a great book. The Bible is a great piece of writing. It's magnificent, and I've read it, and well, I haven't read it all, the book cover to cover, but I've read various parts of it. Enormously impressed. Just as I said, going back to people like Joseph Campbell, that there are great stories in it too, and there are great moments of great wisdom. But at the same time, are many contradictions, and it bothers me that some people will embrace those contradictions as um, as their religion or as their code of living, and they'll stand by what to me is uh, not a decent code, not a good moral code that has repressive. I don't know. I'm not going to go in. I don't want to go into details, but has aspects about it that I think are very questionable. And no, okay, I used Christianity as an example, but you can look at every religion and you can see different degrees of uh, some of there are some sects within various religions that are far more repressive or far more oppressive
Sure.
um, than others. There are much more liberal versions of Judaism, Christianity, Buddhism, you name it. Um, so um, it's all different degrees, but to me, I think there is. I think all the great writers, all the great writings, um, are full of great moral stories, or um, journeys through which we can read or view in terms of storytelling in a film, etc., that can give us elements of wisdom that can help us through our lives that we can live by.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm deeply troubled uh, re- re- um, by certain aspects of religious practice.
Yeah.
Um,
But it does
but
seem from
I'm not offended by it, like I'm not offended as long as they use their religion in a not in a good constructive decent way. That's fine.
well, it does seem like you do believe there are truths that are universal.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
if you're talking about different stories that all
Oh yeah.
have morals in them, those are all truths, right? That connect together.
Yeah. I get worried when we talk about truths because that's when we become um, that's when we what's the word? We get sort of quite
Black and
hard.
white.
Yeah, yeah. That there are sort of that's what I mean about that's what the human mind is such a complex thing where it's where we all have contradictions. I must have lots. Yeah, I've got probably riddled with contradictions, but
Yeah.
but and none of us are perfect. Um,
No, that's true.
that's just getting back to what you were saying again, because I'm jumping all around the place. What we're getting back to what you're saying about actors and American actors and Oscars and the best actor, etc. Um, I have been on a set where, excuse me, where I know I've been working with an actor and I thought they think they're the best actor around, here. They think they have no humility about them. They have ego. They have a they have a lot of ego.
Yeah.
And sometimes when I watch an actor act, and you can see the ego getting in the way because to be a really good actor, um, you have to be vulnerable. You really have to be vulnerable. You have to make that step where, if you're a woman, you think, well, I'm not going to look very pretty in this scene, but that's what's required, and I'm going to go with it. I'm going to
Yeah.
commit myself to this. Don't worry about the makeup, Um, or if I'm a male actor, okay, this is going to expose me as a real chump, but I got to do it and I've got to commit myself to it, because that's what's the aspect of the character. And I know in the next scene you'll understand why I'm a chump or whatever it is. But you have to, you have to make those journeys, and that's the great thing about being an actor to make those journeys. I envy great writers too that can take us through all sorts of worlds and journeys and agonies and suspense, etc. And I was watching Andor last night, and the latest. I don't know if you watch Andor. It's part of that Star Wars series. It's great. I recommend it if you haven't seen it. And there's a real crisis in Andor right now. It's the best of all the Star Wars series ever. It's far more realistic, and the performances are absolutely brilliant. The writing is fantastic.
Mm.
Um, it's very, can I say it's very adult um, aspects of it. But the morals of the story, the morals of the story are just fantastic. We forget that Star Wars itself, as simplistic as it was, has a great moral story. You know, there's the Empire and they're the rebels, and they're fighting for something. Um, and you have to have these. It's like a Western. I'm rambling, I'm sorry. But it's like all those old West. I love Westerns. I love watching some of those old 1940, 1950s John Wayne Westerns or
Oh
other
yeah.
Westerns, Glenn Ford or all those great right all those wonderful, wonderful actors. Um, and a lot of those stories are really, really mythological stories about, the battle between good and bad, you know,
Yes.
good and evil, etc. They're and it's a genre. The Western is a genre through which we can journey through all these dilemmas and all these stories, just as we use sci-fi or we use, other genres too.
Yeah.
Crime, lots of crime um, uh, movies that are about crime or whether they private eye or they're police or whatever, have all sorts of moral dilemmas in them, which is wonderful. That's the great thing about storytelling. I'm sorry, I'm getting carried away here.
No, I agree with you. I love stories as well. In art form of film or book, it's incredible, and there's almost always, even I've been reading more children's books lately just because I'm in a phase of wanting to read children's books for some reason. Life is hard, so sometimes you just want to pick up a children's book, and they make me cry because there's something true in them, even though they're simply said. It's
Sure,
still very
sure.
poignant.
Well, you see, one of the great things about growing up in the household that I, I grew up in was that my mother impressed upon us to read. And I remember in my very early days reading all sorts of books. And I know she's sort of out of favor with people these days, but I don't know if it's happening in America, but she's back in favor here, and that's Enid Blyton. And I don't know if you're familiar with Enid Blyton, she's an English writer who all the world over, her books were famous, The Famous Five and the, what is it, The Secret Seven, which were
Okay.
seven, and then there was The Famous Five, and I think The Famous Five were the younger group, and The Secret Seven were the older group, or it might be vice versa. But her stories were always about kids, groups of kids that discovered something untoward that was going on, and they had to talk. And Constable Plod, I don't know, forgotten what his name was. Um, he, he was always inadequate, and the kids had to solve the the, the,
Yeah.
the, ki- the kids had to sort of somehow solve the problem if they could get out, and their mum or dad would let them after dinner, etc. So that they were all sort of caught up in these domestic problems, but they still were sort of into mysteries and etc. They're great books. They're wonderful books to read. They're a little simplistic, etc. But to go on those kids' journeys when we were kids, we just loved them. We were devoted to them. We were just waiting for the next one to come out because she did a whole series of them. And many of those kids' books are like that. There are kids' books. My wife in her career has been a writer, and she wrote books for teenagers that were sort of great little adventure books too, where they were sort of into solving problems or something was going on in the community that they weren't happy about, and they'd sort of, you know, it was almost like sort of a crime novel, but it wasn't really. It was something more childish than that. But
Did you
but
ever read Beatrix Potter?
oh yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Aren't those
yeah,
amazing? I loved when animals would
yeah.
talk.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. The- well, that's it. You see, and Beatrix Potter, they were sort of stories of there were sort of little moral stories too.
Oh
But
yeah.
if you haven't read them, I recommend you read the Enid Blyton books because this they're they're kids books, but they're fantastic.
Hmm.
Um, um, yeah, but I agree. Some kids books are fantastic. And I have grandchildren too, and they're growing up and they're reading books, and it's fascinating to observe the kind of stories that are available. I think really, even though I think not as many people are reading books today as they did when I was young because of television, etc. When I go into the bookshop, the books that are available for kids are enormous. The choice they have is just fantastic.
They have a
And
lot, yeah.
I just envy them going through those lovely journeys that they go through.
I
But once again,
agree. And
sorry, getting back to drama, that's what's so good about um, reading books like that and getting storytelling is just magnificent. As I said, right from when we were cave people, hunter gatherers, we had this urge to tell stories. I mean, after all, when the sun went down and you sat around the fire, what else was there to do? You know, and someone had to tell stories, and that's why the shaman or whoever they were, as groups got bigger and bigger and expanded, there was a storyteller. There was somebody in the group who was good at telling stories, who could entrance all the families, etc., that surrounded the fire. That there was a time, and they've always been there.
yeah, you're right. It's true. Well, Bruce, I want to ask you one more question. be respectful of your time because I know we've been speaking so long. It's just flown. You mentioned that you're almost 80, and I wanted to ask you, what is one thing that you are very grateful for that you have learned about life, or that you have learned is important, or that you find most valuable about life now that you've lived for decades? I'm only in my 20s. I haven't lived long, so there's still, Lord willing, there's still more for me to learn. But I just wondered if there was anything that has struck you as the most important thing maybe you've learned so far.
Uh, yeah, I've never, I haven't thought much about that question. Look, I think just off the top of my head, I think one of the things that I have learned that I think is really important, and because that's right, I'll be 80 in September this year, is that when you, in my journey, especially when I was young, I went through some very, very low points in my life, really low. I won't go into the details, but uh, the thing that I've learned is when life gets really bad, when you think that's it, when you think you've reached a dead end and there's going to be nothing more out of it, there is. It gets life. Life has its ups, life has its downs, and it has its ups. And there's always something else around the corner. I've been when I look back on my life, I don't regret a thing. I don't regret the moments when I was really down, when I thought, God, is there no end to this? You know, uh, um, when I was absolutely desperate, in a desperate state. I don't even regret that because that journey was sort of necessary for me to appreciate how good this moment in time is, how good every moment in time is. And it's interesting, like someone said, oh, one day at a time, you always take life one day at a time. And in a way, we do often worry too much about the future. I think we do, even though the future doesn't look good right now. And I think, and I must admit, I'm a news hound. I'm always reading. I subscribe to the New York Times. I subscribe to my local paper here and the Guardian and various English, British papers. I subscribe to a lot, and so I'm always reading the news, finding out what's going on in the world, and it bothers me, right? I write letters to the editor complaining about this or making a point about that, and I seem to get published. But all the same, I might worry about these things, but all the same, I know that one has to put one's life in perspective. That, that as I said, no matter how desperate, no matter how bad things get, things will get better. But they won't get better on their own. You've got to make something. You've got to do it yourself. And as
Hmm.
long as you can get up, as long as you can get up and create something, then I think life does have its rewards. And and like it's interesting you're interviewing me because I've made all these films, but for me, acting's just a job. It's just a job. That's all. It's not the end all and be. It's not the be all and end all. It's not. It's just a job. And when I go to bed at night, well, I have friends around me, a friend down the road that I know very well, who's a professor of, he's a professor of fine arts. So his world is fine art. I have a very good friend of mine up the road who's a psychiatrist. I've got also a friend who's a plumber. I've got a very, very good friend who's a builder. And I've got lots of actor friends. I've got friends in all sorts of worlds, but I don't sort of seek to go to the opening of shows all the time, and I do because sometimes I get invited, and sometimes if it's a show worth seeing, I'll go and see it. But I don't like crowds, especially when I'm going to see a show and it's opening night. I don't like crowds. Um, all this sort of glad-handing people and being nice to people. There's lots of friends there I see and say hello, hello, but I like to get home and I like to get away from I like the privacy of just being here at home with my wife and my family. I just, people, people often expect too much. And I just I feel grateful I reckon I've had a good life. It's had its ups and downs, as I said, lots of ups and downs, but that's the exciting thing about life. If you don't have ups and downs, it's going to be a pretty boring life.
That's true. Though I was thinking, I'm very much like you. I'm the same. I don't like big crowds, and I always feel so pressured when there's so many people surrounding me because I feel like I have to talk to everyone and I need to make them all happy, and then that just makes me feel more stressed. Um, I was gonna say though, you should just wear like a Mouth of Sauron costume, and no one's gonna want to come up to you. Just wear big black teeth and just keep smiling. No one's gonna say anything to you, and you're gonna be able to leave.
You think so?
Yeah, much quicker. I mean, who wants to look
Well,
at black teeth?
maybe I will. Well, see, I'm 6'6", so I'm very not hard to see in a crowd. You see, that's one of the things. I can't bury myself into it like people who are a little shorter than me. But
But you do, I hope you have a cup of coffee or something you love while you're reading the news, because to read it every day, I don't even do that. It's too depressing for me. I hope you have
oh
something that you can look at and be like, oh, this is good, even if you're looking at something and you're like, this is bad.
yeah, see, I mean, you're young. You've got a life ahead of you, and the journeys that you're going to have are going to be enormous. I mean, it I don't know whether you're on an up period now or on a down period or whatever, but whatever journey that you're on right now, life is going to change. You don't know when it's going to change. Life can hit you, present things to you quite unexpectedly. It might be a real challenge. It might be something really, really challenging in the sense that, you might wonder whether or not you want to immerse yourself in it. Or it could be something enormously sort of satisfying and joyful, etc. But we've all been through these dramas. That's the great thing about filmmaking and seeing all these stories and seeing someone go through the agony of, whatever it is that they're doing, having to humiliate themselves or whether it's that or whether it's James Bond trying to solve a problem or whether it's someone in a domestic drama, etc. But whatever it is, that's what life is about. Life is about challenges and how we meet them. Don't ever give up. That's the main thing. Don't ever give up. Keep the flame burning. And that's my I guess that's my sort of code. I guess I like to keep that flame burning. And that's why I say I volunteer all the time, and with the benevolent fund, etc. I mean, we had a meeting of the benevolent fund, the Actors Benevolent Fund, just last Monday, and we're dealing with people that are, you know, in crisis. Number of people in crisis that we're having to deal with and having to figure out how we can help them financially or whether or not that they need someone. One person um, needs a mobility scooter to get around in, etc. Another person has a personal crisis who's dying, and so on. So you're dealing with those people. So I must confess, you know, we do try and um, help them in any way that we can. But when you leave those meetings, you think, wow, here I am here. I'm a very lucky person, very lucky.
Well, Bruce, I have to say, I'm so glad that our journeys got to pass, that I got to talk to you and they got to intersect in this time. Because I have learned a lot, and you know so much about the craft of acting and also your passion for storytelling. And I can tell you think deeply about things, and I think that's amazing. I always think it's a good thing to think about the world, to think about people. These are important things, and you seem to grasp that life has meaning and it matters, and that's very important. So I
Mm.
want to thank you for letting me intersect your life, even on a Zoom screen, to just get to know you better.
Well, it's interesting because I feel I haven't really given you much in the way of chatting. It's been a bit of a meandering conversation, but I hope there's something worthwhile there.
Oh,
Well,
yes.
it's been a pleasure actually. Yeah, thank you very much.
You're very welcome. And again, make sure to wear the black tee for the next social event.
I'll
Let me know
I'll
how it
I'll,
goes.
I'll keep that in mind. But it's been great chatting with you, and you go well. You go well because you've got a great life ahead of you. Remember that.
Thank you. All right.
Yeah.
Bye, Bruce.
Bye bye. Bye bye. Go well. Thank you. Ciao, ciao.